40 years ago, Black Ridge Copper Mine was sealed after what newspapers described as a catastrophic tunnel collapse. 12 miners were reported dead. The lower levels were declared too unstable for recovery crews. The entrances were filled with reinforced concrete, and the entire site was abandoned within weeks. That explanation appeared in every official report. It also left out the only part that mattered. None of the bodies were ever recovered. For decades, the mine sat untouched on the side of the mountain, slowly disappearing beneath trees, loose rock, and rusted fencing. Most people eventually forgot it had ever existed. The men who had worked there never did. If anyone asked about the collapse, they would answer politely. If anyone asked about going back inside, the conversation usually ended. Then copper prices surged. Almost overnight, abandoned mines all over the country became valuable again. Black Ridge was no exception. A private mining company purchased the property, reviewed the surviving engineering reports, and announced plans to reopen the lower levels using modern equipment. According to the company, the original disaster had been caused by outdated supports and poor excavation methods. With today's technology, they said, there was no reason the mine couldn't operate safely again. Several retired miners were invited to visit the site before construction began. None accepted. One former supervisor did arrive for a planning meeting. He studied the blueprints in complete silence for nearly 5 minutes before asking one question. "Are you reopening the lower tunnels?" When the engineers answered yes, he folded the maps, pushed them back across the table, stood up, and walked out without another word. They never saw him again. Construction continued anyway. 3 months later, the first inspection crew arrived. There were 8 people, a project manager, 2 mining engineers, a surveyor, 3 experienced miners, and an electrician whose job was to restore power wherever possible. The inspection wasn't supposed to be dangerous. They weren't extracting ore. They weren't blasting rock. They were simply documenting the condition of tunnels that had been sealed for 4 decades. At sunrise, they descended through a newly drilled access shaft that connected to the old workings, several hundred feet below ground. Fresh ventilation systems pushed clean air through the tunnels. Portable floodlights illuminated every major intersection. Every member of the crew carried modern gas monitors, radios, emergency oxygen, and enough supplies for 2 full days underground. The company had prepared for every hazard listed in the safety manuals. The first several hours went exactly as planned. Air quality remained stable. The tunnel supports held. There were no dangerous gas pockets, no unexpected flooding, no major collapses. What they found instead was something much stranger. The mine looked interrupted. Rust covered the machinery. Dust coated the rails. Old drilling equipment still rested exactly where workers had left it. Lunch buckets remained beside walls. Tools leaned against support beams. It didn't look like a place that had been abandoned forever. It looked like a place where everyone had suddenly stopped working in the middle of an ordinary day. Around noon, the surveyor confirmed that the original maps were surprisingly accurate. Every junction matched. Every chamber was exactly where it should have been. The project manager laughed and said, maybe the old stories had grown over the years. One of the miners answered without smiling. Stories usually do. By late afternoon, everyone had relaxed. The tension from the morning had mostly disappeared. People started joking over the radios. Someone suggested they might finish an entire day's work ahead of schedule. Then one of the miners stopped walking. He aimed his flashlight at the wall beside an abandoned rail line. Fresh scrape marks, long, deep, running through the layer of dust. The engineer stepped closer. They're recent. Nobody argued. The exposed rock inside the grooves was still lighter than the surrounding stone. Whatever had made them had done so recently. The project manager photographed the marks before asking the obvious question. Could construction equipment have reached this area already? The answer was no. The new access shaft connected to the opposite side of the mine. No modern machinery had entered these tunnels yet. The crew continued toward the exit. Nobody mentioned the scrape marks again. About 10 minutes later, the electrician slowed down near an old steel maintenance door, built directly into the rock. Unlike the others, this one had originally been sealed with poured concrete. Most of that concrete was still there. Most of it. A section near the bottom had fractured, not shattered, not collapsed. Separated, as if something behind the door had forced it outward just enough to create a narrow black gap between the steel frame and the surrounding stone. The electrician stared at it for several seconds before calling the others over. One by one, they gathered around the doorway. Nobody spoke. Finally, one of the miners quietly asked the question every one of them was already thinking. Was that opening there when we came in? No one could answer, because not a single person remembered seeing the door at all. The maintenance door wasn't marked on the company's digital map. That alone was enough to delay the trip back to the surface. The project manager asked the surveyor to compare the old paper blueprints with the updated scans loaded onto his tablet. Neither showed a maintenance room behind the steel door. It simply wasn't supposed to exist. One of the miners brushed decades of dust away from the concrete surrounding the frame. The concrete wasn't cracked because of age. The fracture looked fresh. Small fragments still rested on the ground directly beneath the opening. The engineer crouched beside them and picked one up. The broken edge was clean. It hadn't been exposed for very long. Could the temperature have done this? Someone asked. The engineer slowly shook his head. Not underground. Nobody suggested opening the door. They were already behind schedule, and whatever was behind it wasn't part of the inspection. The project manager photographed the damage, logged the location, and ordered everyone to continue toward the access shaft. As they walked away, The electrician looked back one last time. The narrow black gap beneath the door was barely visible from a distance. Even so, he couldn't shake the feeling that it hadn't been empty. The crew reached the access shaft shortly before sunset. Once everyone was above ground, equipment was checked, batteries were replaced, and the day's findings were reviewed inside the temporary site office. The fresh scrape marks, the damaged maintenance door. Neither finding had an obvious explanation. Still, nothing they had seen justified shutting down the project. The report was filed. Work would continue the following morning. That night, heavy rain swept across the mountain. Most of the crew stayed in a small lodge less than 15 minutes from the mine. After dinner, the conversation naturally drifted back to the old stories surrounding Black Ridge. One of the younger engineers laughed as he scrolled through articles about the collapse. The newspapers couldn't even agree on how many people died. Another miner looked up from his coffee. They never counted the ones they couldn't find. The room fell quiet for a moment. The project manager eventually broke the silence. We're not here to solve a 40-year-old mystery. We're here to inspect a mine. Nobody argued, but nobody looked convinced either. The next morning, the crew returned underground. Their first stop was the maintenance door. The project manager wanted another set of photographs before moving deeper into the lower tunnels. The moment they reached the rail junction, everyone stopped. The gap beneath the steel door was wider, not by much. Maybe another inch, maybe 2. No one could say for certain. Memory isn't reliable underground. Distances become strange. Shadows change. Perspective shifts. Still, every person standing there believed the opening had grown. The surveyor placed a measuring tape across the fracture and recorded its width. Then he checked the photograph taken the previous afternoon. Nobody spoke while he compared the images. Finally, he looked up. It wasn't this wide yesterday. Nobody smiled. The project manager stepped toward the door. He aimed his flashlight through the opening. The beam disappeared into darkness. No wall. No machinery. Just empty space. He called for a thermal camera. The electrician returned a few minutes later with the handheld unit. The display showed cold rock, cold steel. Nothing else. Satisfied, the project manager lowered the camera. Document it. We'll report it after today's inspection. The crew moved on. This time, they followed the western extraction tunnels toward sections that hadn't yet been surveyed. The deeper they traveled, the older everything became. Support beams darkened with age. Steel rails bent beneath collapsed debris. Entire side passages had vanished behind cave-ins. Nearly 3 hours passed without incident. By early afternoon, the surveyor asked for a short break while he recalibrated his laser scanner. The crew spread out across a wide loading chamber. Some checked equipment. Others drank water. One miner wandered only 30 or 40 feet away to inspect an overturned ore cart resting beside the tracks. He was still visible, still within earshot. Nobody paid much attention. Less than a minute later, someone asked where he'd gone. At first, they assumed he had stepped behind the cart, then behind one of the support columns. The project manager called his name. No answer. Another miner walked over. The flashlight swept beneath the ore cart. Behind it, around it. Nothing. His helmet lamp still lay on the ground. It was switched on. The helmet lamp illuminated the loading chamber with a steady white beam. It hadn't rolled away. It hadn't been damaged. It was simply lying on its side, still shining into the darkness. The miner who had walked over first immediately called the missing man's name. No response. The project manager ordered everyone to spread out, but nobody was to leave another person's sight.
For the next 20 minutes, they searched every tunnel connected to the chamber.
Nothing. No footprints. No blood. No dropped equipment. Nothing except the helmet lamp. Eventually, the surveyor noticed something unusual. The dust covering the floor had been disturbed.
Not by boots.
Something much heavier had crossed the chamber. The marks weren't clear enough to identify. Whatever had made them had dragged against the rock just enough to disturb decades of settled dust before disappearing into one of the collapsed side passages. The opening was barely large enough for a person to squeeze through. One of the miners aimed his flashlight inside. The beam disappeared after only a few feet. Solid rock blocked the rest. "There isn't enough room for anybody to fit through," he said. The surveyor quietly answered, "There wasn't." Nobody liked the way that sounded. The search continued for another hour. Eventually, the project manager made the decision nobody wanted to hear. They would report the missing worker and return with a larger rescue team. As they headed back toward the access shaft, the electrician stopped walking. "Do you hear that?" Everyone froze. At first, nothing. Then it came again. A metallic sound. Slow. Distant. Like steel scraping against stone somewhere deep inside the mountain. It lasted only a few seconds before everything became silent again. One miner tried to laugh. Probably old rails shifting. Nobody answered. The sound hadn't come from below them. It had come from ahead, from the direction they were already walking. The crew reached the surface shortly before sunset. Within 2 hours, local authorities had secured the entrance. The missing worker's family was notified. County search and rescue was called in. By midnight, another 7 people had arrived at Black Ridge. Unlike the inspection crew, the rescue team had extensive underground experience. They treated the situation like any other missing person operation. The briefing lasted less than 10 minutes. Last known location. Possible escape routes. Air quality. Tunnel stability. The rescue leader asked one final question before entering the mine. Any wildlife down there?" The project manager shook his head. "Not unless something survived 40 years without food." Nobody laughed. Just after 1 o'clock in the morning, the rescue team descended. This time, there were 15 people underground. The inspection crew guided them back to the loading chamber where the miner had disappeared. The helmet lamp was exactly where it had been left. Still on, still shining. The batteries should have died hours earlier. One of the rescuers picked it up. It shouldn't still have power. The electrician checked it. It shouldn't. Before anyone could say another word, a radio crackled. "I've found something." The voice came from one of the rescuers exploring a nearby service tunnel. Everyone hurried toward him. He was standing beside a wall of exposed rock. At first, nobody understood what he was pointing at. Then the flashlight settled on it. Fresh scratches. Hundreds of them. Some shallow. Some deep enough to expose pale stone beneath the surface. They covered almost the entire wall. None were older than a few days. The rescue leader stepped closer. This wasn't caused by machinery. One of the miners slowly nodded. There wasn't any machinery down here. Another rescuer measured one of the grooves with his hand. It was wider than his palm. Much wider. The rescue leader immediately ordered everyone back into a tighter formation. No one moved alone anymore. No one spoke above a whisper. The atmosphere underground had changed. The missing miner was no longer the priority. Getting everyone else back to the surface was. Then, every flashlight in the tunnel flickered. Just once. Only for a fraction of a second. But it was enough. Because during that brief flash, every person in the tunnel saw the same thing. Something enormous crossing the intersection ahead. Too large to be a man. Too fast to identify. And completely silent. When the light steadied again, the tunnel was empty. No one moved. Every flashlight remained fixed on the empty intersection ahead. The rescue leader was the first to speak. "Back up." Nobody argued. 15 people began retreating together. One careful step at a time. No one turned around. No one wanted to lose sight of the darkness ahead. The tunnel remained silent. For nearly a minute. Nothing happened. Then one of the rescuers stopped. My lines caught. He had been carrying a safety rope connected to the rest of the team. He pulled once, twice. It wouldn't move. Another rescuer stepped beside him to help. The rope wasn't snagged on the rock. It was moving, very slowly, sliding deeper into the darkness. Nobody touched it again. The rescue leader cut the line with a knife. "Keep moving." The entire team continued backing toward the loading chamber. Less than 30 seconds later, they heard it. A heavy impact somewhere behind them. Then another. not footsteps. Something much heavier, like enormous weight dropping onto solid rock. The impacts grew closer. Nobody waited for another order. The retreat became a run. Flashlights bounced wildly across the tunnel walls. Equipment slammed against helmets. Someone fell. 2 others pulled him back to his feet before anyone became separated. When they reached the loading chamber, one of the engineers looked toward the abandoned ore cart. The missing miner's helmet lamp was gone. No one had touched it. The floor where it had been lying was empty. The rescue leader immediately changed the plan. This operation is over. We leave right now. The nearest route back to the access shaft passed through a narrow haulage tunnel. Halfway there, the surveyor suddenly froze. The map. Everyone looked at him. This tunnel isn't on the map. The project manager grabbed the old blueprint. He checked again. Then again. The surveyor was right. According to every drawing they had, they were standing inside solid rock. Before anyone could process that, the first support beam snapped. The sound echoed through the tunnel like a gunshot. Another beam failed. Dust exploded from the ceiling. Run! The collapse raced through the tunnel behind them. Rock crashed onto the rails. Steel supports folded. The entire mountain seemed to shake. One by one, the crew threw themselves through the final reinforced doorway leading to the modern access shaft. The last engineer barely cleared it before thousands of tons of rock buried the entrance behind him. Silence. Nobody spoke for almost a full minute. They simply stood there, counting faces. 15 had entered. 12 came back. At sunrise, state officials sealed Black Ridge copper mine for the second time in its history. The official report blamed an unexpected structural failure during a rescue operation. The 3 missing workers were listed as presumed dead. Recovery efforts were considered impossible. Within days, fresh concrete filled the access shaft. Steel barriers were welded into place. The company abandoned the project. Again. Months later, investigators reviewing photographs from the inspection noticed something they had somehow overlooked. Every picture taken inside the mine had been carefully examined after the incident. Equipment, tunnel conditions, structural damage, nothing unusual, until someone enlarged the very first photograph of the old maintenance door, the one taken before anyone disappeared. There, inside the narrow gap beneath the steel door, just beyond the reach of the flashlight, something was looking back, not a face. Not enough to identify, just 2 pale reflections. Watching the inspection crew from the darkness long before they realized they weren't alone. Black Ridge was permanently closed. No company ever tried to reopen it again. Because after 3 different investigations, everyone reached exactly the same conclusion. The mountain wasn't hiding a collapsed mine. It was hiding something that had never wanted the mine opened in the first place. Stories like that usually end with the investigation, with the mine being sealed, with everyone agreeing never to go back. But the next case didn't begin beneath a mountain. It began inside a factory that was scheduled for demolition. And just like Black Ridge, it started with one worker who simply disappeared. The old Ashcroft steel plant had been empty for almost 18 years. For decades, it had employed nearly 2,000 people and supplied steel to construction projects across 3 states. Then the contracts disappeared. The furnaces shut down. The workers left. The gates were chained. Nature slowly reclaimed everything the company had abandoned. Broken windows, collapsed roofs, trees growing through cracked concrete. Rainwater filling loading docks where freight trains had once arrived every morning. To most people, it was nothing more than another forgotten industrial ruin. To the demolition company that purchased the contract, it was one final paycheck. The schedule looked simple. Disconnect the remaining utilities. Strip anything worth recycling. Demolish the structures section by section. 6 weeks of work. Nothing unusual. The only problem was the deadline. A redevelopment company had already purchased the land. Every day of delay would cost hundreds of thousands of dollars. The crews were told the same thing during every morning briefing. Stay on schedule.
For the first several days.
They did. The administration building came down without incident. The storage warehouses were emptied. Miles of old electrical cable disappeared into recycling trucks. Everything was progressing exactly as planned. The only building left untouched was the main production hall. It was enormous, nearly 1/4 of a mile long, 4 stories high, packed with conveyor systems, overhead cranes, maintenance platforms, and thousands of tons of rusting machinery. Too large to demolish until every reusable component had been removed. That meant sending workers back inside, mostly at night. Heavy equipment occupied the building during the day. The dismantling crews worked after sunset. There were 12 people assigned to the final night shift. Most had spent years taking apart abandoned factories. They joked that empty industrial buildings all sounded the same after dark. Metal expanding as temperatures changed. Water dripping through broken roofs. Loose chains swinging in the wind. Every strange noise had an ordinary explanation. At least, that was usually true. The shift began just before 8 p.m. The foreman gathered everyone around a folding table near the entrance. Assignments were handed out. Electrical panels, cooling pipes, copper wiring, control cabinets. Everyone worked in pairs. Nobody questioned it. The building was simply too large for anyone to cover alone. By 9 o'clock, generators powered temporary work lights across the production floor. Cutting torches echoed through the steel framework. Forklifts moved scrap toward the loading bays. Radios buzzed constantly. It felt less like an abandoned factory and more like one slowly coming back to life. Around 10 that night, the security guard completed his first patrol of the outer fence. Everything looked normal. No signs of trespassing, no broken locks, no vehicles outside the construction crews. He signed the inspection log and returned to the control room overlooking the production hall. From there, he could see almost the entire factory through dusty observation windows. Workers moved beneath the overhead cranes. Sparks from cutting torches lit sections of the darkness. Forklifts crossed the concrete floor, carrying stacks of dismantled steel. Business as usual. Then, one of the forklifts stopped moving. The guard frowned. Its headlights were still on. The engine was still running, but it hadn't moved in nearly 2 minutes. He picked up his radio. "Forklift 3, you okay down there?" Nothing. He tried again. Still nothing. The foreman answered instead. "I'm heading over." The security guard watched from above as the foreman crossed the production floor. It took him almost a full minute to reach the vehicle. The driver wasn't inside. The forklift had simply been left idling in the middle of the aisle. The foreman checked the nearby work area. Nobody. He searched behind stacked machinery. Nobody. He called the driver's name loud enough for the entire production hall to hear. Only his own voice echoed back through the factory. Within minutes, every worker had stopped what they were doing. The missing operator's hard hat was eventually found, beside one of the old assembly lines. His gloves were lying next to it. His radio was still transmitting. All anyone could hear through the speaker was the sound of heavy breathing. Then the transmission ended. No one saw who had been breathing. And no one ever admitted pressing the button to end the call. The entire production hall was searched before midnight. Every workstation, every maintenance room, every office overlooking the factory floor. The missing forklift operator simply wasn't there. The foreman checked the attendance sheet twice. 12 workers had started the shift. Only 11 answered when he called their names. The security guard replayed the security cameras covering the production hall. The operator could be seen driving normally between 2 assembly lines. He stopped beside a conveyor system that had already been dismantled. He climbed out of the forklift, looked towards something outside the camera's view, then walked into the darkness. He never appeared on another camera. The police arrived less than an hour later. They treated it like a missing person case. The factory gates were locked. No fences had been cut. No vehicles had entered or left. There was only one conclusion. The missing worker was still somewhere inside the building. The search continued until nearly 3 in the morning. Nothing. Eventually, the officers suspended the operation until daylight. The demolition company wanted to stop work immediately. The redevelopment company refused. Every hour the project sat idle cost money. The police had found no evidence of foul play, no blood, no signs of a struggle, no damaged property. Legally, there was no reason to shut the site down. The following evening, the workers returned. Nobody wanted to. But contracts have a way of winning arguments. This time, the rules were different. Nobody worked alone. Every pair kept constant radio contact. The foreman ordered mandatory check-ins every 5 minutes. For the first hour, everything seemed fine. The conversations over the radios became relaxed again. Someone even joked that the missing operator had probably wandered out through an old service tunnel. Nobody laughed very hard. Just after 10 o'clock, the generators shut down. The production hall disappeared into darkness. Only emergency lights remained. Rows of dim red fixtures flickered to life high above the steel framework. The factory looked completely different. The machinery no longer resembled equipment. It became hundreds of enormous black shapes stretching into the darkness. The electrician hurried toward the generator room with another worker. According to the gauges, nothing had failed. Fuel levels were normal. Circuit breakers hadn't tripped. Every system insisted the generators were still running. Yet the building had lost power. 3 minutes later, the lights came back by themselves. Nobody could explain why. The foreman ordered everyone to stop working until every electrical system had been checked. As the crews gathered near the center of the production hall, the security guard called over the radio. "I've got movement!" Everyone looked toward the observation windows. What kind of movement? I don't know. I only saw it for a second. The foreman immediately headed toward the control room. 2 workers followed him. When they reached the upper level, the security guard was gone. His chair was pushed back. The monitor wall still displayed live camera feeds from around the factory. His flashlight lay on the floor beneath the desk. Still on, his radio rested beside it. Still transmitting. The foreman picked it up. At first, there was only static. Then came a voice. Very quiet, almost whispering. "I think it's still in here." The transmission stopped. The foreman answered immediately. No reply. He tried again. Nothing. The workers searched every office connected to the control room. There was only one staircase leading down. No one had passed them. No windows were open. No other exits existed. The security guard had disappeared from a locked room. The foreman slowly looked back across the factory floor. 11 workers had arrived that night. Now, only 10 were standing below. The second disappearance changed everything. By sunrise, the demolition company had suspended all work inside the production hall. Not because they wanted to, because no one was willing to go back inside. Police investigators returned with a larger team. This time, they weren't looking for a missing worker. They were looking for evidence that a crime had taken place. The building was searched from top to bottom. Maintenance rooms, electrical tunnels, storage areas, office floors, boiler rooms, even ventilation shafts large enough for a person to crawl through. Nothing. It was as though both men had simply stopped existing. By late afternoon, detectives reached the same conclusion as the night before. No blood, no signs of violence, no forced exits, no bodies, no suspect. The redevelopment company demanded the project continue. The police couldn't legally stop it. Once again, the night shift reported for work. Only this time there were 8 workers instead of 12. 3 had already quit. 1 simply never answered his phone again. The foreman didn't blame them, truthfully. He wanted to leave too. But walking away meant losing the contract. Losing the contract meant losing his company. He couldn't afford that. Before anyone entered the building, he laid down new rules. Nobody would leave visual contact. No headphones, no closed doors. Every 5 minutes, everyone answered a radio check. If anyone missed one, the entire shift stopped immediately. For the first 2 hours, the rules worked. Workers stayed close together. Every radio check was answered. The production hall remained strangely quiet. Almost too quiet. Normally, an abandoned factory is never silent. Wind whistles through broken windows. Loose metal rattles. Water drips from old pipes. But that night, there was almost nothing. Even the workers noticed it. One of them finally asked the question everyone had been avoiding. "Do you hear any birds?" The others listened. Nothing. No pigeons. No crows nesting in the roof. No bats. No rats. Nothing living. The foreman had spent nearly 20 years inside abandoned factories. He'd seen stray dogs sleeping in machine rooms, foxes wandering through warehouses, entire families of raccoons living inside office ceilings. But never. Nothing. At exactly 11:18 p.m., another radio check was called. Every worker answered, except one. The electrician. The foreman called again. Still nothing. Everyone immediately headed toward the electrical room together. The door was open. His toolbox sat on the floor. A portable work light illuminated the room. The electrician wasn't there. No one entered alone. The entire crew searched every corridor connected to the electrical room. Nothing. The foreman checked his watch. Less than 4 minutes had passed since the missed radio check. No one could disappear that fast. Then, one of the workers noticed something above them. Fresh, muddy footprints. Not on the floor. On the steel maintenance walkway nearly 30 feet overhead. Everyone aimed their flashlights upward. The footprints continued across the narrow catwalk, before disappearing into darkness beyond the lights. The foreman stared for several seconds. No one had been assigned to the upper walkways. There was no ladder anywhere nearby. One worker whispered what everyone else was already thinking. How did anyone get up there? Before anyone answered, A loud metallic crash echoed through the factory. It came from somewhere above them. The entire catwalk shook. A shower of rust drifted down through the flashlight beams. Then, something extremely heavy began running across the steel grating overhead. Fast. Much too fast. The sound crossed the building in seconds, then stopped, directly above them. Nobody looked away. Nobody spoke, because every person standing there knew whatever had made those footsteps was now standing perfectly still, listening. Nobody moved. The entire crew stood frozen beneath the catwalk. The sound above them had stopped, but the weight was still there. They could hear the steel groaning under it. The foreman slowly raised his flashlight. The beam barely reached the walkway. Nothing. Only rusted handrails, steel grating, darkness. Then, one of the workers noticed something. The footprints. Everyone looked. The muddy prints were changing, not disappearing, moving. One by one. New prints were appearing across the catwalk, heading away from them. There was no visible body, no shadow, nothing they could actually see. Only fresh footprints forming in wet rust. One after another, as though something impossibly heavy was walking through the darkness. Nobody waited to see where they ended. Out! The foreman's voice echoed across the production hall. 8 workers turned and ran. The emergency exit was nearly 300 yards away. Every flashlight bounced wildly across abandoned machinery. Behind them, the steel walkway exploded with noise. The running had started again, louder than before. It wasn't following the catwalk anymore. The impacts were spreading. Left. Right. Ahead. As if whatever was above them could cross the entire network of overhead walkways without slowing down. One worker glanced upward for only a second. I saw. He never finished. Something slammed into the catwalk directly above him. The entire structure shook violently. Bolts rained onto the concrete. Everyone scattered. The worker who had looked up stumbled beside an old rolling conveyor. By the time the others reached him, he was gone. His flashlight lay spinning across the floor, still shining, still moving in slow circles. The foreman didn't stop. He couldn't. If they stopped for one person, none of them would leave. The remaining workers reached the emergency exit and forced the heavy steel doors open. Cold night air rushed inside. Every surviving worker stumbled into the parking lot. They didn't stop running until they reached the security gate. Someone counted. 8 had entered. 7 had come out. No one spoke. No one cried. Everyone simply stared back at the enormous factory. Every window was dark. completely still. Police sealed the Ashcroft steel plant before sunrise. This time, they ignored the redevelopment company's complaints. 4 workers had disappeared inside the same building within 3 nights. The demolition contract was canceled indefinitely. Months later, engineers entered the plant one final time to determine whether the structure could safely remain standing. They found no evidence explaining the disappearances. No hidden rooms, no collapsed passages, no underground tunnels, nothing. The factory was demolished remotely over the following weeks. Excavators pulled down the walls. Controlled explosions brought down the furnaces. Thousands of tons of steel were hauled away for recycling. When everything was finally cleared, surveyors stood on bare concrete where the production hall had once stood. For the first time in decades, there was nowhere left for anything to hide. Or so they believed. One surveyor reviewing the demolition drone footage noticed something unusual. In every pass over the collapsing factory, one section of the roof sagged exactly the same way. Not because the steel was weak, because something beneath it seemed to absorb the impact before disappearing into the dust. The footage was enhanced, frame by frame. Nothing conclusive was ever found. Just a single moment, less than half a second long, where an enormous shape appeared to move beneath the collapsing roof before vanishing forever. The report was never released publicly. Officially, Ashcroft Steel Plant remains the site of 4 unexplained disappearances. Unofficially, the demolition crews still say they didn't destroy whatever lived inside. They only took away its shelter. The next investigation began hundreds of miles away. There were no abandoned factories, no underground tunnels, only miles of protected forest that closed to the public for 1 week every hunting season. No one questioned the closure until a veteran game warden failed to come back out. Every hunting season, Blackwood National Forest closed one section of its wilderness for exactly 7 days. The closure happened every year, always during the second week of November. The official explanation never changed. Wildlife management, population surveys, habitat protection. Hunters accepted it without much complaint. The restricted zone covered nearly 40 square miles. There were no hiking trails, no campsites, no public roads, just dense forest that stretched over steep ridges, narrow valleys, and miles of untouched wilderness. For decades, the closure attracted almost no attention, until one experienced hunter asked a simple question. If it's closed to us, who's still leaving boot prints out there? The question spread through local towns faster than the Forest Service expected. Several hunters claimed they had seen government trucks driving into the restricted zone after the gates were locked. Others reported hearing helicopters late at night. Some insisted they had seen lights moving between the trees where no roads existed. The Forest Service denied every rumor. the closures continued exactly as they always had. Eventually, people stopped asking. 5 years later, the same week arrived again. Roadblocks went up before sunrise. Warning signs were posted at every trailhead. The gates were locked. By noon, the restricted section of Blackwood Forest was officially empty. At least, that was the plan. Senior Game Warden Daniel Mercer had worked those mountains for almost 23 years. He knew every fire road, every creek, every abandoned ranger cabin. He had rescued lost hikers, tracked injured bears, arrested poachers. He trusted the forest more than most people trusted their own neighborhoods. When new rangers joked about the annual closure, he never joined the conversation. He simply reminded them to stay out of the restricted zone. None of them had ever asked why. On the third night of the closure, Mercer received a radio call just after 9:30 p.m. A motion sensor had been triggered near the northern boundary. Normally that meant one of three things: a deer, a bear, or someone ignoring the closure. Mercer drove the nearest service road alone. The sensor sat beside an old maintenance trail no longer marked on public maps. His truck headlights swept across the trees. Nothing moved. He stepped outside. The forest was unusually quiet. Cold air drifted through the pines. Leaves shifted beneath his boots. He checked the sensor. Still active. He aimed his flashlight down the abandoned trail. Fresh boot prints, large, deep, only one person. The tracks crossed the boundary fence and continued into the restricted zone. Mercer studied them for several seconds. No hesitation. No signs of wandering. Whoever had crossed knew exactly where they were going. He radioed dispatch. "I've got one subject inside the closure. Requesting a second unit." Dispatch answered immediately. "Nearest ranger is 45 minutes away." Mercer looked back toward the trail. The prints were fresh enough that rainwater hadn't settled into them. If he waited, they would disappear. He hesitated, then made the decision he would later become known for. "I'm going in." His flashlight disappeared between the trees. The radio remained open. For the next 18 minutes, Dispatch listened as Mercer quietly described what he was seeing. The boot prints never changed direction, never circled, never slowed. It was as if the person ahead had walked the same route many times before. Then Mercer stopped talking. For nearly 30 seconds, Dispatch heard nothing except the sound of wind through the trees. Finally, his voice returned. Calm. Much quieter than before. "That's impossible." The dispatcher immediately asked what he had found. Mercer didn't answer. Instead, he whispered something that investigators would replay hundreds of times over the following months. "I'm following one set of footprints." "So why are there footsteps behind me?" Dispatch called his name 3 times. No answer, only the steady sound of leaves shifting beneath someone's boots. But the rhythm was wrong. Mercer's footsteps stopped. The second set didn't. For several seconds, the dispatcher listened as the unknown footsteps continued walking through the forest. Then they stopped too. Silence. Another dispatcher joined the call. They increased the radio volume. No one spoke. No breathing. No movement. Just wind. Finally, Mercer came back on the radio. His voice sounded controlled. Too controlled. I've turned around. Another pause. There's nobody here. Dispatch immediately instructed him to return to his truck. Mercer didn't respond right away. When he finally spoke, he sounded confused. My footprints. What about them? They're gone. Dispatch assumed he meant the rain had washed them away. There hasn't been any rain, Mercer interrupted. I mean all of them. The ones I was following. The ones I made coming in. They're all gone. The dispatcher looked at the weather radar. Dry skies. No wind strong enough to cover tracks. Nothing made sense. Walk back the way you came. I can't. What do you mean you can't? I'm standing where the trail should be. It isn't here anymore. The dispatcher froze. Mercer knew those woods better than anyone. If he said he couldn't find an old maintenance trail, something was wrong. A second ranger finally arrived at the boundary almost 40 minutes later. His truck remained exactly where Mercer had parked it. Engine cold, driver's door open, flashlight missing. The ranger followed Mercer's GPS signal for nearly half a mile before it suddenly stopped transmitting. Not because the battery died, because the device simply disappeared from the map. The search continued until sunrise. Tracking dogs were brought in. Drones searched the canopy. A helicopter flew repeated passes over the valley. Nothing. Not a single boot print. Not one broken branch. No dropped equipment. No blood. No sign that anyone had walked through the forest at all. By noon, state officials suspended the search. Not because they wanted to, because the restricted zone was entering its 4th day of closure. Whatever operation had been planned there would continue. Mercer's disappearance wasn't announced publicly. The Forest Service told reporters only that a senior ranger was missing during routine patrol. Inside the ranger station, the mood was very different. Every officer knew Mercer didn't get lost. If he couldn't find his way out, no one could. That evening, investigators reviewed the final GPS points from his radio. Something immediately caught their attention. Mercer had reported walking in a nearly straight line the entire time, but his recorded route told a different story. It formed an almost perfect circle, less than 200 yards across. He had spent 18 minutes walking around the same patch of forest without ever realizing it. One of the younger investigators stared at the screen. That has to be a GPS error. The station's mapping specialist quietly shook his head. It can't be. Why not? He zoomed in until individual trees appeared on the satellite image. Then he pointed to the center of Mercer's recorded path. There aren't any trees there. Everyone leaned closer. The circle surrounded a small clearing. A clearing that didn't exist on any official map. And according to satellite imagery taken just 2 weeks earlier, it had never been there before. By the 5th day of the closure, the clearing had become the center of the investigation. No one was allowed near it without authorization. The Forest Service quietly diverted patrol routes. Additional roadblocks appeared overnight. Officially, nothing had changed. Unofficially, every ranger in the district knew something had. A special search team arrived before sunrise. Unlike the earlier rescue effort, this group wasn't made up of volunteers. These were veteran game wardens, wilderness trackers, and search specialists. Most of them had spent decades navigating forests where a wrong decision could be fatal. If anyone could find Mercer, it was them. There were 9 people in the team. They entered together. Every member wore a body camera. GPS tracker. Emergency locator beacon. No one was permitted to leave visual contact. The clearing appeared exactly where the satellite image suggested it would. Roughly 70 yards across. Perfectly circular. The trees around its edge looked healthy. Inside, there was almost nothing. No large rocks. No fallen logs, no animal tracks, just dark soil covered by a thin layer of dead leaves. The search leader crouched near the center. This wasn't here last season. One of the trackers nodded. The trees are older than the clearing. Everyone looked at him. He pointed toward the tree line. The roots should extend into the open ground. They don't? It's like the forest stopped growing here. No one had an explanation. The team spread out. Slowly. Methodically. Each person searched a different section while remaining within sight of everyone else. For nearly 20 minutes. Nothing happened. Then one of the trackers raised his hand. I found something. The group gathered around him. Half buried beneath the leaves was Mercer's flashlight. It still worked. The batteries were nearly full. The glass wasn't broken. There wasn't a scratch on it. The search leader picked it up. If this has been here for 2 days, why isn't it wet? Rain had fallen the previous afternoon. Everything else in the clearing was damp. The flashlight was completely dry. Before anyone answered, every GPS unit on the team lost signal at the same time. 9 screens. 9 identical warnings. Signal lost. One ranger looked up toward the sky. Clear. No storm. No heavy cloud cover. Nothing that should interfere with satellite reception. The body cameras continued recording. The radio still worked. At first. Then the static began, a faint crackling, almost too quiet to notice. The search leader ordered everyone back together. No one argued. As they regrouped, the youngest ranger stopped walking. "What is it?" He didn't answer immediately. He was staring toward the opposite side of the clearing. "I thought..." He swallowed. "I thought I saw Warden Mercer." Every flashlight turned toward the trees. Nothing. Just trunks disappearing into shadow. The search leader lowered his voice. "Nobody leaves this clearing alone." The young ranger nodded. "I know what I saw." It looked like him. Standing between those trees. Another ranger stepped closer. "Did he move?" "No." "Did he call your name?" "No." "What did he do?" The young ranger hesitated. "Nothing. He was just watching us." The search leader immediately ordered the team to begin withdrawing. Slowly. Nobody turned their backs to the tree line. The clearing remained completely silent. Halfway to the southern edge, one of the veteran trackers frowned. "Stop!" Everyone froze. He slowly pointed toward the center of the clearing. The leaves were moving. Not from wind. Not from animals. The ground itself was sinking, only by an inch or two. Barely enough to notice. But it wasn't stopping. The entire center of the clearing was settling lower, as though something unimaginably heavy beneath the soil had begun to move. Nobody stepped onto the sinking ground. The search leader immediately ordered everyone back. Slowly. No sudden movements. The team retreated toward the edge of the clearing while keeping every flashlight aimed at the center. The depression continued to deepen. 3 inches. 5. Then nearly a foot. Not because the soil was collapsing, because the entire surface seemed to be lowering as one solid piece. There were no cracks, no loose dirt sliding inward. It looked as though something beneath the clearing was pushing the earth downward from below. Then, it stopped. The forest became completely silent. One of the trackers whispered, "It's waiting." No one answered. The search leader made the decision. "We're leaving." The team backed into the trees without turning around. The clearing remained motionless behind them. For almost 100 yards, nothing happened. Then every radio erupted at once, not static. A voice, the same voice. 9 radios, perfectly synchronized. Dispatch. It was Mercer. Weak. Out of breath. "I found the trail. I think I'm almost out." The search leader grabbed his microphone. "Mercer, where are you?" No answer. Only breathing, heavy, uneven. Then Mercer spoke again. "Don't let it know." The transmission cut off. Every radio went silent. One of the rangers checked the signal strength. Impossible. Mercer's radio beacon had never come back online. There was no source for the transmission. The team reached the boundary just after sunset. Nobody had been injured. Nobody had disappeared. But every member gave the same statement. Mercer's voice had come from the radios. Not one radio. All of them. The search operation ended the following morning. State officials expanded the restricted area indefinitely. The annual 7-day closure quietly became permanent. Public maps were updated. Several forest roads simply ceased to exist. Most people never noticed. Hunters stopped asking questions. New warning signs appeared. Unauthorized entry became a federal offense. The official explanation cited unstable terrain and environmental hazards. Few believed it. Years later, a maintenance contractor replacing old boundary fencing made an unusual discovery. Buried beneath layers of weathered leaves near the original trail, he found a metal evidence marker. The number stamped into it matched the one assigned to Warden Mercer's search. According to every official record, that marker had been placed inside the clearing, not outside it. The contractor reported the mistake. Surveyors were sent to verify the location. They never found the clearing, not because it had changed, because it was gone. The forest had grown back as though the open ground had never existed. No disturbed soil, no unusual vegetation, nothing. Only trees. Perfectly ordinary trees. When investigators compared aerial photographs taken over the previous decade, they noticed something no one had seen before. The clearing had never stayed in the same place. Every year, during the week the forest was closed, it appeared somewhere different. Always perfectly circular. Always the same size. Always disappearing before the gates reopened. No explanation has ever been offered. The restricted section of Blackwood National Forest remains closed to this day. Officially, to protect the wildlife. Unofficially, because nobody has ever explained what left those footprints, or what answered the radios. The next investigation didn't take place beneath a mountain, or inside an abandoned factory, or deep in a protected forest. It began beneath the streets of a growing city. Construction crews were expanding an old transit tunnel when they broke through a concrete wall that wasn't shown on a single blueprint. Everything that followed started with one impossible discovery. There was fresh air coming from the other side. The breakthrough happened at 2:14 on a Wednesday morning. For nearly 8 months, crews had been expanding an aging transit tunnel beneath the city. The project wasn't unusual. The original tunnel had been built in the 1960s. Passenger traffic had doubled over the years, and engineers needed a second line running parallel to the first. Most of the excavation had gone exactly as expected. Concrete, reinforced steel. Solid bedrock. Every few hundred feet, surveyors confirmed the tunnel matched the construction plans almost perfectly. Until drill number 4 stopped. The operator assumed the cutting head had struck another section of reinforced concrete. That happened often. He shut the machine down and called the site engineer. Within minutes, several workers gathered around the face of the tunnel. The drill had punched through something. Not rock, not concrete. An empty space. The opening was only 12 inches across, just large enough for a flashlight. The engineer leaned toward the hole. Cold air flowed steadily into the tunnel. Not a breeze. A constant stream. He frowned. There shouldn't be anything back there. The surveyor checked the digital plans. Nothing. He unfolded the original blueprints. Still, nothing. According to every document available, solid rock continued for another 80 feet. Yet air was pouring through a wall that wasn't supposed to exist. Work stopped immediately. The city engineering office was notified. An inspection team arrived before sunrise. Their first theory was simple. An undocumented maintenance tunnel. Old cities were full of forgotten utility passages, water lines, steam corridors, electrical access routes. Sometimes entire sections disappeared from modern records. Nobody seemed especially concerned. Not yet. By noon, permission had been granted to widen the opening. The workers cut carefully through the remaining concrete. What they uncovered wasn't bedrock. It was another wall. Older. Much older. The concrete was darker. Rougher. Poured by hand rather than machine. Its surface showed decades of mineral staining. One of the engineers ran his hand across it. This wasn't built in the 60s. Nobody disagreed. The second wall stretched beyond the limits of the excavation. Left. Right. Up. Down. No visible edge. As though someone had built an enormous sealed chamber long before the modern subway ever existed. The project manager ordered drilling suspended until structural engineers completed another survey. The deadline didn't matter anymore. Everyone wanted to know what was behind it. That evening, ground-penetrating radar was brought underground. The operator slowly scanned the wall. The display filled with interference. He adjusted the frequency. The interference remained. He recalibrated the equipment. Nothing changed. The wall refused to produce a readable image. It was the first time anyone on the project had seen an entire section of reinforced concrete appear almost blank on the display. One technician quietly muttered, "Maybe it's too thick." The chief engineer wasn't convinced. If it were that thick, we wouldn't be feeling air. Late that night, the city approved one final inspection opening. Just large enough for a remote camera. No people, no entry, only a camera. The drilling took less than 15 minutes. As soon as the final section broke away, The airflow became noticeably stronger. Dust drifted toward the opening. The engineer lowered the inspection camera through the hole. Its light disappeared into darkness. The monitor showed only empty space. No walls, no floor, no ceiling. The beam simply faded into black. He rotated the camera. Nothing. He tilted it downward. Nothing. Then, the cable stopped moving. The engineer checked the spool. Nearly 100 feet of cable had already entered the opening. The camera still hadn't reached anything solid. Silence spread across the tunnel. The project manager finally asked the question everyone was thinking. How can there be a space that large beneath the city? Nobody answered. The engineer began pulling the camera back. The cable came easily at first. Then suddenly, it became heavier. Not stuck. Heavier. As if something on the other end had started pulling back. He immediately released the spool. The tension vanished. Slowly. He pulled again. This time the camera returned normally. When it emerged from the opening, everyone crowded around the monitor. The lens wasn't damaged. The recording was. For almost the entire inspection, the screen showed nothing but darkness. Until the final 3 seconds. The camera had rotated on its own. Not toward the tunnel, toward the darkness behind it. Frame by frame, the playback revealed something impossible. 2 enormous, pale shapes reflecting the camera's light. Not moving, not blinking. Simply waiting, far beyond the end of the cable. The recording was reviewed over and over again. Every engineer, every supervisor, every technician. All of them reached the same conclusion. The final 3 seconds couldn't be explained. The project manager copied the footage and sent it to the city engineering office before sunrise. By noon, the reply came back. The recording was dismissed as a camera artifact. Low light. Digital noise. Compression errors. The recommendation was simple. Continue the excavation. Nobody underground believed that explanation. Still, contracts don't stop because people feel uneasy. The following night, work resumed. This time, no one approached the opening alone. Additional floodlights were installed. A temporary steel barrier surrounded the wall. 2 security guards remained on site, while the excavation crew prepared to widen the access point. The chief engineer gave one instruction before anyone started. If anything changes, everyone walks away. The concrete came apart more easily than expected. Within an hour, the inspection hole had become an opening nearly 6 feet wide. Large enough for a person to step through. No one did. Cold air poured steadily into the tunnel. It carried no smell, no dust, no trace of damp earth. Just clean, dry air. One technician frowned. That's impossible. Every underground space had a smell. Concrete, oil, standing water, rust. Something. This place smelled like nothing at all. The project manager ordered a drone inside. Unlike the inspection camera, the drone could navigate freely. Its rotors lifted it through the opening. The live video appeared on 2 monitors. The drone crossed the wall. Its light swept across empty darkness. For several seconds, there was still no floor, no ceiling, no walls. Then, the ground appeared. Smooth concrete. Perfectly level. The drone descended. Its landing sensors confirmed a solid surface. The pilot slowly moved forward. The beam illuminated an enormous corridor stretching far beyond the drone's range. The walls were bare. No pipes, no cables, no markings. Nothing to suggest the space had ever been used. The corridor was far larger than the transit tunnel itself, almost wide enough for 2 subway trains to pass side by side. "Keep going," the engineer said. The drone continued. 50 feet. 100. 150. Still nothing. The pilot checked the signal strength. Perfect. Battery normal. Air quality sensors normal. Temperature 56 degrees. Completely stable. Everything suggested the corridor should have been accessible. Yet no city record mentioned it. At nearly 300 feet, the drone spotlight found something. A doorway. Massive steel doors stood open against the walls. Each one was taller than a city bus. The pilot slowed. The drone entered. Beyond the doors lay another chamber, even larger than the corridor. Rows of enormous concrete support columns disappeared into darkness. The drone climbed higher. Its camera still couldn't see the ceiling. Someone quietly whispered, "How big is this place?" Nobody answered. The pilot rotated the drone toward one of the nearest columns. Its surface was covered with scratches. Long, deep, running almost perfectly vertical. The engineer leaned closer to the monitor. "That's not excavation damage." The grooves were too evenly spaced, too deep, too deliberate. The drone approached within a few feet. One of the surveyors suddenly pointed at the screen. There. Near the base of the column, the concrete floor was covered with dust. Across that dust, fresh tracks. Not boot prints, not tire marks. Something heavy had crossed the chamber recently. The impressions continued around the far side of the column, where the drone couldn't yet see. The pilot carefully moved forward. The drone rounded the column. Nothing. The track simply ended. No return path, no second set. They stopped in the middle of the floor, as though whatever had made them had simply ceased to exist. No one spoke. The room remained silent. Then every floodlight inside the construction tunnel flickered. Once. twice. The workers instinctively looked away from the monitors, only for a second. When they looked back, the drone was no longer facing the column. It had turned almost 180 degrees. The pilot's hands froze over the controls. "I didn't do that." The video feed now looked directly toward the open steel doors. Beyond them, at the far end of the corridor, something was standing where nothing had been just moments before. Too distant to identify, too large to be a person. And slowly, it took one step toward the drone. Nobody breathed. The figure remained at the far end of the corridor. It hadn't appeared gradually. It had simply been there. The drone hovered in place. Its spotlight wasn't strong enough to reveal any details. Only the outline. Broad, unnaturally tall, completely motionless. The pilot whispered without taking his eyes off the monitor. "Zoom." The camera zoomed in digitally. The image became grainy. Still, the shape refused to resolve into anything recognizable. It wasn't standing beneath a shadow. It was simply too far away. The engineer checked the drone's distance reading. 612 feet. It can't look that large from that far. Nobody argued, because they were all thinking the same thing. If the distance reading was correct, whatever stood in that corridor was enormous. Then it moved again. One slow step, not toward the drone, toward the nearest wall. Its outline disappeared behind one of the giant support columns. The pilot immediately pushed the controls forward. The drone accelerated. Its motors echoed through the chamber. 400 feet. 300. 200. The column grew larger on the monitor. The figure should have emerged from the other side. It never did. The drone circled the column. Nothing, no doorway, no side passage, no debris large enough to hide behind. Just smooth concrete. The engineer stared at the empty screen. Where did it go? Nobody answered. One technician quietly replayed the live recording. Frame by frame, the figure stepped behind the column and simply never came out. The project manager finally gave the order. "Bring it back." No one objected. The drone turned toward the steel doors. Halfway there, its proximity alarm activated. Warning: object ahead. The corridor looked empty. The pilot slowed. The warning continued. Object ahead. Distance: 9 feet. The spotlight illuminated nothing except open air. The drone stopped. The alarm continued. 7 feet. 6. 5. The engineer leaned toward the screen. There has to be something there. The pilot carefully nudged the controls forward. The drone lurched violently, as though it had struck something solid. The video shook. One propeller stalled for a fraction of a second. The drone recovered and drifted backward. Everyone in the tunnel fell silent. There was nothing visible in front of it. Nothing. Yet the collision log clearly recorded an impact. The engineer checked the telemetry. The drone had contacted an object nearly 12 feet tall and over 20 feet wide, floating in the middle of the corridor. The pilot swallowed. Go around it. The drone moved left. The obstacle warning followed. Still there. He climbed higher. Still there. Lower. Still there. It was as though an invisible wall stretched from floor to ceiling. The only path back was to fly around it. The drone began a wide arc through the chamber. Nearly 40 seconds passed before the warning finally disappeared. Only then did everyone appreciate the size of whatever the sensors had detected. It wasn't a person. It wasn't machinery. It occupied an enormous section of the corridor, and they had never seen it. The drone reached the steel doors again. The opening to the construction tunnel was visible in the distance. Workers on the other side could even be seen waiting behind the safety barrier. The pilot relaxed for the first time all night. Then every monitor froze. 1 frame, 2, 3. Signal lost. The drone didn't crash. The telemetry remained active. Battery normal. Altitude stable. Motor speed normal. Only the video had disappeared. The engineer switched to the thermal feed. Instead of the chamber, the screen displayed a single massive heat signature. It filled nearly the entire frame, too close to the camera to distinguish any shape. The pilot whispered, "It isn't in front of the drone." Nobody understood. He slowly pointed at the monitor. If it were, the heat would be farther away. He looked around at the rest of the crew. His face had gone completely pale. It's standing. Right behind it. Nobody spoke. The thermal image remained frozen on the monitor. One massive heat signature, perfectly centered. The drone itself was no longer visible, only the thing standing behind it. The pilot slowly backed the drone away. The heat signature grew larger, not smaller. The engineer frowned. That's impossible. If the drone was moving backward, the distance should have increased. Instead, whatever the camera was facing seemed to move closer. The pilot pushed the controls harder. Maximum reverse speed. The telemetry confirmed it. The drone was accelerating toward the opening, yet the thermal image continued filling more of the screen. Someone whispered, "It's following." Then, the video feed returned. For less than half a second, the workers saw the corridor, the steel doors, the opening leading back to the construction tunnel, and something crossing directly behind the drone. Not running, walking. One enormous step, then another. The feed disappeared forever. Every warning on the controller activated simultaneously. Signal lost. Camera failure. Obstacle detected. Connection terminated. The telemetry vanished. The drone no longer existed on the system. Nobody volunteered to retrieve it. The project manager didn't ask. Instead, he ordered the opening sealed immediately. The workers didn't argue. Steel plates were welded across the breach before sunrise. Additional concrete was poured behind them. By the following afternoon, there was no visible sign that an opening had ever existed. The city officially announced a temporary geological concern. Construction was suspended indefinitely. Within a week, the entire tunnel expansion project had been canceled. Publicly, the decision was blamed on unstable underground conditions. Privately, every worker on the night shift signed confidentiality agreements. Most of them transferred to other projects. Several left underground construction entirely. The chief engineer retired 6 months earlier than planned. He never accepted another tunnel contract. Years later, an independent audit reviewed archived engineering documents related to the canceled expansion. Most of the project files were exactly where they should have been. Survey reports, structural calculations, safety inspections, equipment logs. One file, however, didn't belong. It had no author, no creation date, no department listed, just a single page tucked inside the engineering archive. Across the top, someone had typed one sentence: "Do not reopen the eastern wall." Below it was a grainy black and white photograph. It wasn't from the modern construction project. Judging by the equipment, it had been taken decades earlier. The image showed another excavation crew standing beside the very same concrete wall. The opening behind them was already visible. The workers were smiling. None of them appeared alarmed. Investigators searched employment records to identify the men in the photograph. They found every name, every personnel file, every payroll record. But no record that any of those workers had ever returned after that project ended. The file was quietly removed from the archive. No explanation was ever entered into the system. Today, commuters pass through newer transit tunnels every morning without realizing another unfinished line still exists somewhere beneath the city. Official maps end at a reinforced concrete wall. Behind it, according to every public record, there is only solid rock. The engineers who stood there know otherwise, because they felt the cold air. They watched a camera disappear into a space no blueprint acknowledged. And they learned something that every investigation in this collection eventually discovered. Some places aren't hidden because people failed to find them. They're hidden because someone found them once before and decided they should never be opened again.